Russia captures Pokrovsk. The Russian armed forces are carrying out cleanup operations in the city of Pokrovsk. The encircled Ukrainian troops are surrendering without resistance, and in this context, the question arises, is a deep Russian offensive beginning now? Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Buenos Aires, Argentina, we begin broadcast number 285 of Demolishing Myths Talks, completely live. Thank you very much for joining us, and remember to help us with a thumbs up. On the other side of the screen, joining us from Madrid, Spain, is our dear Fernando Moragón. Fernando, how are things over there?
Querido Fernando Moragón. Fernando, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Bueno, pues aquí estamos, es decir, hemos pasado la resaca del Halloween.
Well, here we are. I mean, we've gotten over the Halloween hangover. Let's see, there's something I have to admit. The North Americans, that is, the United States, really scored a goal on us. Big time. I mean, with Halloween, as I like to say, instead of Halloween, I say Halloween. And the thing is, before November 1st, the holiday on November 1st, which has always been a holiday here, at least in Spain, was All Saints' Day. A holiday that was, let's say in quotes, a bit sad. That is, people would go to cemeteries to bring flowers and remember their loved ones who had already passed away. Well, now the schools and everything are full of kids. The worst ones are the parents. I mean, kids dressed up for Halloween everywhere, and the parents with them. Of course, what the parents did was say, come on, whatever, let's go do Halloween, you know. And then several parents from the school would get together and say, let's do Halloween and have a few beers. This isn't about the kids anymore with the kids. It's just using the kids and Halloween as an excuse to have a few beers. And it was quite a day. In the afternoon, you couldn't even move around, but not because of cars, because of the kids, the hordes of kids coming out from everywhere with their parents, not looking anywhere. It's something incredible. But that's already happened. It's already happened. And, well, we have to admit that the celebration has changed. And for example, here in Spain, and specifically in Madrid, it's not just popular, it's huge. I mean, even the schools themselves. In fact, a school right next to me held a Halloween party, meaning they actually celebrate Halloween and all that. So how was it? Tell me, how was Milei's Halloween in Argentina? How did it go?
Well, the main ghost here, without a doubt, is Milei. But he does indeed promote the celebration of Halloween, because he supports everything that comes from the United States, and the greater the cultural imperialism, the better for him. So, my reflection on Halloween, I honestly have absolutely no sympathy for an exogenous celebration imported through cultural imperialism. But, that said, sometimes one just can't go against reality.
But there too in Argentina, people dress up and all that, kids and so on.
More and more kids, but it's still not as widespread as, for example, in Europe or the United States. Everything's fine with Halloween in the US. Yes, but I think he dressed up. No.
Yes, I think Trump was receiving some kids and one of them was dressed up as Trump, one of the children. But, well, I don't know, I've seen something like that, but I'm not sure. Anyway, indeed, we have a much bigger Halloween, let's say the Day of the Living Dead. In Europe, we have a bunch of politicians who are living dead, meaning they're zombies. And then we have the disaster of Zelensky in Ukraine, who acts as if it has nothing to do with him. No, Prokhorov, where is Prokhorov? I don't know where Prokhorov is, doesn't ring a bell. Ah, well, that doesn't matter, how wicked. I mean, it's a place that, it's true, that's how Russians are, that's not going anywhere. So that's how we have Mr. Zelensky trying to avoid and promote the catastrophe of Prokhorov and what's coming his way. We'll talk calmly about it later, in a tremendous, tremendous final stretch. Let's see, because...
How about we start the analysis with the help of the map? Fernando, what's the situation right now in Pokrovsk, in Kupiansk, on the front line, generally speaking?
Let's go. There's the map. Well then, let's start in the north and leave Pokrovsk for the end, since it's in the south. In other words, we'll save the big part for last. Let's start in the north if that's okay with you, and do a general overview, because right now the entire front is on the move. That is, we're advancing everywhere.
That is, the Russians are advancing, for example, in Kupiansk.
Well, don't worry, I also speak slowly. I mean, I talk like this. And now we're going to head toward Volchansk, and that's it. Well, in the meantime, let me tell you something. Let's see, remember we've talked about it in several shows and so on at length about the Burevestnik missile. Right, remember, this nuclear-powered missile, a cruise missile. We also talked later about the Poseidon test, that tremendous nuclear torpedo. And in case there was any doubt about the Russians' intentions and the Americans hadn't noticed, well, no more and no less than yesterday, I think it was yesterday, yes, yesterday or the day before, the Russians launched a new submarine. Well, a new submarine. Well, yes, okay, a nuclear submarine. Well, yes, a nuclear submarine, but does it have anything special? Yes, it's just like the Belgorod. Ah, the Belgorod. What's the Belgorod? Well, the Belgorod is the submarine that carries the Poseidon missiles, or rather, the Poseidon torpedoes, to be precise. The Poseidon torpedoes... Armando, put the video here. They've launched it, I'm telling you. Do you have the video?
Yes, but if we start with the front, and then...
It was to kill time while you were going up. I had already told you. Well, Volchansk, there's almost nothing left of it now. If we look at the city itself, we can see that the red area, which represents the Russians, have taken over the entire city except for a small part shown in yellow, as Ezekiel points out, a tiny area. In other words, Volchansk has practically fallen as well. And now comes what the Ukrainians fear. You can see it clearly there. The Ukrainians' fear is about what comes next. That is, the advance of the Russians toward the towns and villages surrounding Volchansk. So that's a first source of pressure. In other words, the Russians, let's not forget, Volchansk has been a tremendous battle, to the point that it's been about 1 year and 7 months since that first incursion. The crossing of the border between Ukraine and Russia, the internationally recognized border, and the advance up to Volchansk. Well, it's been a tremendous, tremendous battle. The city is devastated. I mean, when you see images of Volchansk, it's completely destroyed. There's a river in the middle, I can't remember its name, which has also made things more complicated. There used to be an urban center where there were, well, yes, there used to be, because now there isn't. I mean, there were multi-story buildings and such, tall ones, which also made things more difficult. And well, finally the Russians, in this renewed push, let's not forget that in the month of October, and well, in the little we've had of November, but in October, as we've seen, there's been an acceleration of Russian activities and attacks all along the front line. Well, we can say that Bozan, has practically fallen. Formally, that's what's happening, and therefore another city has fallen into Russian hands, an important strategic city, as we'll see now. What's happening in Kharkiv, in this area, in a small village located at one of the edges, that is, on the border, forms a kind of pyramid, well, more like a triangle, roughly speaking. And at the corner of that triangle, there's a small village that the Russians captured, and later, there was another Russian incursion into Kharkiv from the border, which has been expanding until it made contact with the entire mass of troops and the large area the Russians have already taken in Kharkiv, right along both banks of the Oskol River, which we'll get to in a moment. And therefore, from Kupiansk, here you can clearly see these two areas. Then that little corner we see up there, which is a small village they took, is clearly visible on the right side of the map. Ezekiel Bistoletti shows it to us. That small border area has been expanding, and here, the area marked as gray has already been captured. In other words, it has joined the area we also see north of Kupiansk, forming a very interesting axis. You can see it clearly there. As he points out, this has already joined up and an expansion is forming. In fact, a small pocket is forming here, if you look, from which the Ukrainians will have to withdraw. There is activity, therefore, also in this area of Kharkiv, and small gains, but ones that are putting the Ukrainians in a serious situation because they don't have enough personnel, because they don't have enough troops. So if we see that they're advancing in Moskansk, we also see that they're advancing here. Now we'll go to Kupiansk. They're advancing in all sectors of the front. What we're seeing is that, as is happening in Pokrovsk, and especially we'll mention that at the end, in the southern area of Donetsk and along the border with Dnipropetrovsk, they're advancing at a dizzying speed. Well, then I say this is because pressure is being applied along the entire front line. How are you doing with I see you're having trouble, right? With the map.
Yes, obviously the broadcast doesn't show the interference I'm seeing here, on my monitor, frame by frame. This, despite updating my computer's hardware and software. But well, welcome to the Microsoft world. Little by little, we'll start with the map directly in a new window. With everyone's permission, if you, Fernando, could meanwhile present the situation the old-fashioned way, orally.
Orally, here we go. Well, we've got this as if it were a radio show. Even if you see my big head, pretend you don't. It's like we're narrating a soccer match. And right now the Russians are advancing all along the field, advancing through Bokansk, advancing through Kupiansk, advancing through Pokrovsk. What a great match the Russian team is playing against the Ukrainian team. Something like that. I mean, no, really. I mean, I remember when I was a kid back in the day, in the 70s and so on, when we came back from the countryside, from a place my father had and all that, and you'd get stuck in the Sunday traffic jams when everyone was coming back from the weekend. And there, what did we do? Well, in the car radio, we used to listen to a program called Carrusel Deportivo, where they would tell you about the soccer matches on the radio. They would say, goal at the Bernabeu, goal for Madrid, and they would narrate it for you. So at least, while you were stuck in traffic, you were entertained listening to the soccer games. Well, this is kind of the same. I mean, now what we have is in Kupiansk, Kharkiv. We're still in Kharkiv, in the Kharkiv region. There we have Kupiansk, another highly contested and crucial city because, as you know, it lies on both sides of the Oskol River. This river splits Kupiansk into two halves, and the most important part is, let's say, the western side as opposed to the eastern one. More important because it's bigger, basically. The Russians have been doing one thing for a while now, which is this. They come from the east toward the west, generally speaking. They advance westward, and what they did was, faced with difficulties advancing and taking the eastern part, they crossed further up, north of the city of Kupiansk. They crossed further up, established a bridgehead on the Oskil River, expanded it, moved south, and from the north entered the city of Kupiansk. And now, practically speaking, we can say that the city of Kupiansk, the larger part, the western part, that is the one to the west, is in Russian hands. And not only that, but they have pushed even further south, cutting off practically every possible road and bridge, even pontoon ones that existed over the Oskil River, so that the Ukrainians on the other side couldn't cross, and above all, so that Ukrainian logistics would collapse in that area. And indeed, it is collapsing. There's already talk of some surrenders. And that salient, that pocket that existed in Kupiansk, is disappearing. We'll see it fall soon, just like the city of Kupiansk. The latest news from Kupiansk was that the Russians had not only taken that most important part, the western part of the city, but had also crossed the river themselves and were already taking the eastern part, that is, the other side of the river. So we have that Kupiansk is on its last legs, and we'll see that this... Come on, I don't think it'll last past November. I mean, this November, they'll finish conquering it, that pocket will be closed, and the territory the Russians hold in Kharkiv will increase significantly. And let's not forget what Putin said. I mean, he may or may not follow through, but what Putin said was, any area our soldiers enter, where our soldiers set foot, is Russian territory and will not be returned. He said that, right? Whether he does it or not is another matter, but he did say it. So, once that happens, we're going to try to get some perspective. Once the conquest of Kupiansk is complete, and these areas we've seen start to expand, what we'll see is an advance toward Kharkiv, toward the city of Kharkiv itself. Not to conquer it, not to enter it, we're talking about the second most important city in Ukraine, that would be madness, but rather to challenge the logistics that come through Kharkiv toward the south, toward Izium, toward many other places. And so they will take control of an important part of Kharkiv. Let's say they'll reconquer part of what they lost in the famous 2022 Ukrainian offensive. So, well, this is important. This is important. So we're going to head south, further south. You look a bit frozen. But anyway, let's go south. What do we have to the south, basically? Well, we run into another problem for the Ukrainians, which is the area of Lyman, or Krasny Lyman. This is a city that has been conquered and reconquered several times. That is, it was in Ukrainian hands, obviously. The Russians arrived in 2022 and took it. Later that same year, during the Kharkiv offensive at the end of summer, the Ukrainians retook it. And now the Russians are already entering part of the city, advancing quite rapidly. They're still at the beginning of the attack, but they've been wearing down all the areas around Krasny Lyman, taking them over, occupying the strategic towns. They have cut off, and this is important, one of the main logistical routes of Krasny Liman. And at the same time, they have also cut off the logistics from Krasny Liman to Siversk, which is another very important city, and we'll talk about it in a moment. Well, Krasny Liman is a relatively large city, which I think the Russians will take a bit longer to conquer, but they will conquer it as well. There it is, with relative speed, because we are seeing a certain collapse of the front on the Ukrainian side, that shortage of men that is becoming evident in many places. There it is, we can see it.
There's no need for me to move it, because it has. I left the previous map because I couldn't, Fernando, for some reason. Today, some background process is generating too much interference. This is the entry just mentioned, right?
There indeed.
The roadblock.
Exactly. That is, look at how they've been advancing. About 2 months ago, they were still quite far away, and now they've moved forward very quickly. The capture of Krasny Liman is crucial because it's the gateway that allows the Russians to attack the two major cities in the Donbass that are in Ukrainian hands and serve as the last major defenses, Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. So, to attack Sloviansk, they indeed need to take Liman first, because it's also a very important logistical hub. It connects with Siversk, another city that's also under siege further south. In other words, as you can see, what the Russians are doing, and this is also important from a military standpoint, is trying to more or less straighten the front line. So there aren't, as we see here, a lot of twists and turns, a kind of S shape, because the more S shapes you have, the more personnel you need to deploy. So aligning the front for both sides is very important, and we can see it here. And there we reach Siversk. Ezekiel is showing us here, with a cross, the cut in the road that goes from Krasny Liman to Siversk. There we have Siversk. That is, notice that it's practically encircled already, both from the north and from the south. They're advancing, in fact, you can see it clearly. There are reconnaissance units on the outskirts of Siversk, in the suburbs, scouting and figuring out how to attack the city. Siversk is a much smaller city than Liman.
Siversk es una ciudad mucho más pequeña que Liman. La única carretera que es esa que se está señalando ahí,
the only road, the one being pointed out there, the only connection they would have now is a road that goes roughly towards Sloviansk. But everything indicates that Siversk is going to fall with relative ease. It's not a big city, as I said, and it's also in a low area. Let's say the Russians, especially from the north, are coming from higher ground, which gives them an advantage when descending towards Siversk and taking it. Siversk is going to fall, and that will allow them to advance and align the front, which is, as I said, essential. So this is another city we're going to see fall before the end of the year. Just like Liman, I'm one of those who think that things are now going to speed up and move much faster.
And we're seeing it, as I said, in all the cities so far. Of the 3 cities mentioned, at least the 3 that are more or less large, Lysychansk, Liman, and Siversk, all 3 are in operational encirclements.
Indeed, all 3 are in a critical situation. The same Ukrainian sources say so. When you go into Ukrainian channels, for example on Telegram, and see what they're saying, they report that the situation is critical. And what the Ukrainian soldiers there are saying is that they're having all kinds of problems with their commanders. There are even, in some places, because we can already see it, lost units, or like in the south of Donetsk, ones that can't be found. That is, an entire brigade whose fate is unknown. The 124th, I think it is. So, well, as I was saying, Pokrovsk is, we'll talk about it now, but this is also crucial because as you can see, it's making a huge turn. This has also been an area that cost the Russians a lot to capture. That is to say, the Ukrainians have put up fierce resistance there, and only a couple of months ago, mainly with the capture of the forested area, the areas you see in dark green, that darker green, well, those are forest zones. When you see something darker in general, it's either a lake, a reservoir, or a forest. And you can see that there are many forests to the north. This is a wooded area. They had to take the entire forested zone, which is very large, in order to launch an attack. And well, that whole forested area has already been taken. That's why they're now able to advance from the north. Also, it's a highland area. So Siversk is going to fall, and it's another important city. There we can see it. That's the northern part. And look, there's already a yellow area that's been taken. See up north in the yellow area, you can tell it's a slightly darker yellow. Why? Because of the forest. Whenever you see something darker, it means it's a forest, a lake, or a reservoir. Well, all of this used to be a large forested area. The big difference between Donetsk, the Donetsk People's Republic, and also Luhansk, although Luhansk has been practically conquered for a long time, is that Donetsk, unlike the rest of Ukraine, has forested areas, large urban concentrations, and even though all of Ukraine is flat, somewhat more hills and elevations. There are also lots of reservoirs, lots of rivers. So it's already a complicated area by nature. Quite the opposite, somewhat different from what we'll see later, from what we're already seeing, which is the area beyond Pokrovsk. We'll talk about what's beyond Pokrovsk later. That is to say, well, from here, as I said, Siversk is going to fall, and we move on to the next one. The next one, basically, is Kostiantynivka. Kostiantynivka is the major urban center in the region, one of the large cities. And Kostiantynivka, there you can see a kind of red wedge, and that wedge is already penetrating the entire southern part of Kostiantynivka. In other words, fighting is already taking place inside the city itself. They're coming from higher ground. The fact that they're advancing from that area. A bit further up is the well-known city of Chasiv Yar, which also took the Russians a great deal of effort and an enormous amount of time to capture. But once it was taken, all of this made this advance easier. Ezekiel Bistoletti points it out clearly. The area where they already are, shown in gray, either occupied or in a gray zone, fighting with the Ukrainians. They're also coming from a higher area. This has made the descent toward the city of Kostiantynivka easier. And there, in Kostiantynivka, as you can see, even though it's a large city, it won't be easy for the Ukrainians to defend. As I said, it's in a low area, and at the moment, the Russians, right now, since they're already moving in seriously, and let's not forget that, and advancing here, you can see this famous lake, which is a dark green reservoir. That one has already been taken. And here is Ivanivka, I think it's called a town, well, actually a village, which is the last one that needs to be taken there. Indeed, they're already about to reach the gates of this locality. Well, yes, that one there. They're already entering as well. This is a village right next to Kostiantynivka. Once they take it, the encirclement, the pocket around Kostiantynivka, will expand. Because, as you can see, the only thing between Kostiantynivka and the red zone is this settlement, and they're already entering it, so the pincer will keep closing. Well, Kostiantynivka is also a city that will probably see fall relatively soon. And that would be a blow, a hard hit, because what they have farther north is another city. I think it's called Dubrova or something like that. Don't quote me on that because I always forget. And then there's Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. But anyway, I'm one of those who think that once Kostiantynivka is taken, they'll obviously keep advancing. But this whole front we're seeing from Lyman, Siversk, Kostiantynivka is going to close in. It's going to align itself to move toward those two big cities that are right next to each other, Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. After these obstacles fall, Lyman, Siversk, and Kostiantynivka will start advancing from the north, mainly from the east and also from the south. And the final blow will likely come from, we'll see that later. Ezekiel Bistoletti points that out very clearly. The final blow will probably come from the advance north of Pokrovsk, which will lead to an attack from the rear. Clearly, because these are two rather tricky cities. You can see it clearly on the enlarged map. These two cities are extremely complicated, because here we're talking about the largest ones in the region, and they're right next to each other. Deep down, one could almost speak of a single city. I want to remind you that both of them, don't quote me on this, before the war had more than 100,000 inhabitants. We're already talking about very complex places, with urban centers, with tall buildings that allow for defense. That is to say, Sloviansk and Kramatorsk will be taken, but they'll be taken next year. I mean, there's still time before that happens. Because let's not forget, once Sloviansk and Kramatorsk are taken, it's over. They will have practically conquered almost all of Donetsk. In other words, the Donetsk issue will be over. There would be little left.
If I remember correctly, Fernando, Kramatorsk is the de facto capital of Donetsk, still under Ukrainian control, after the complete takeover of the actual capital of the Donetsk Oblast, which has the same name, Donetsk. So in Kramatorsk, if I'm not mistaken, the government of Donetsk, still in Ukrainian hands, is located.
That's the importance of Kramatorsk, right? I mean, it's the capital of the Ukrainian-controlled part of Donetsk, and the two major cities, the two large urban areas held by the Ukrainians. Once this falls, almost everything will have fallen. Look here how clearly you can see this sort of crescent shape formed by the red zone around Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. You can see it very clearly in red, a kind of crescent. Ezekiel points it out perfectly, showing in advance taking Lyman, taking Siversk, taking Kostiantynivka to close that crescent. And then, if the Russians manage to advance from the north, from Pokrovsk, through the rear toward the north, we can see that they would cut off logistics and leave those two major cities encircled.
This is more or less the idea of what they're going to do. A question, perhaps a bit unexpected, but still interesting. Could Russia, after capturing Pokrovsk further south and Kupiansk further north, maybe even Lyman, instead of launching an attack on Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, the last strong cities, the last fortified Ukrainian cities, fortified, by the way, since at least 2014, carry out a deep offensive toward the western part of Donetsk, even toward Dnipro, to create confusion, and in some way, a larger, broader encirclement of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk?
Yes, of course. What's happening is that the Russians are being very practical here. Along the entire front line, they're probing with that strategy we've talked about many times, the strategy of 1,000 cuts. That is, they apply pressure all along the front, and wherever they see that the Ukrainians' position is weaker, that's where they advance, send in more troops, and break through the lines. If the Ukrainians reinforce that area, no problem. Since they're short on manpower, they're forced to pull troops from another part of the front line. And then the Russians take advantage of that to attack in that sector. So they're in no hurry. They watch how the Ukrainians move in that regard and have no problem waiting, whether in this area or elsewhere. If they see Ukrainian forces weakening in a particular sector of the front, they'll take advantage of it and may delay offensives or attacks in other parts of the front. That is to say, they're going to be very pragmatic about this, very practical, as they have been so far in this war of attrition. Let's not forget that this isn't about conquering cities, although obviously in a war, whoever is winning advances, even if only a little. That's not the goal. The goal is to destroy the Ukrainian army. Once the Ukrainian army is destroyed, the war is over, because they'll have nothing left to fight with. Therefore, what we're seeing is the destruction of the army's operational capacity, and fundamentally also of its personnel.
The
problem the Ukrainians have, as Ezekiel and I have been saying for a year and a half or more, is that, for demographic reasons, as we saw on Friday, they don't have enough people to be recruited into the army. That's why there's all this wild recruitment going on in the streets and so on, grabbing people like crazy, people who don't want to go, people who, when they're taken to the front, run away as soon as they can because they don't want to fight. If they had wanted to fight, they would have signed up as volunteers. In other words, they're fleeing. Right now, they have a serious problem, and there are clashes within the Ukrainian regime's leadership, clashes and criticism of Zelensky, because he has, quote-unquote, let many young people close to 18 and some older than 18 leave, and to avoid being recruited in the near future, they're leaving en masse.
están ya saliendo en masa. De hecho, igual pasa con las deserciones.
In fact, the same thing happens with desertions. We're seeing a growing monthly increase, meaning a very serious rise, especially this year, in desertions that are approaching 300,000 since the beginning of the war. 300,000 desertions or absences from the front. It's true that some of these aren't strictly desertions, but simply soldiers who have been there for months and months, and for whatever reason, go to see their families or take care of personal matters, and sometimes they come back. But fundamentally, desertions, nearly 300,000 desertions, is an enormous number. We're talking about a country that currently, this has already been acknowledged by many people, has around 20 million inhabitants. That is to say, let's not forget that it has nothing to do with the Ukraine of the early years of its independence, which had 52 or 53 million people, if I remember correctly. In other words, at the end of the Soviet Union and the beginning of independence, Ukraine had, according to sources, between 34 and 37 million before the war. That means it had already lost a significant number of people due to poor governance, the impoverishment of a country with extraordinary natural wealth, but where corruption, oligarchs, and many other factors led many Ukrainians to migrate to different parts of Europe in search of a better life. They had already lost a huge portion of their population, and on top of that, the birth rate is very low. Then, once the war had started, I can't recall the name, Ukrainian expert from the Ukrainian administration acknowledged that at least 5 or 6 million Ukrainians had left at the beginning of the Russian special military operation. That is, if we subtract those 5 or 6 million, which are probably more, possibly up to 8, from those 34 or 37 million, plus those who are now in territory already conquered by the Russians, let's not forget, from Crimea to this entire region, and these are the most populated regions. Meaning that within Ukraine, apart from Kiev, the most populated areas, Luhansk, Donetsk, Crimea, well, they are already in Russian hands, or almost in Russian hands. So we can easily subtract another, although it's hard to know, well, another 5 or 6 million. So as we keep subtracting, we end up with roughly those 20 million we were talking about.
Now, Fernando, precisely because of this, for this reason, a deep offensive could make sense, even though so far, indeed in a war of positions, deep wedge offensives logically don't occur often. But considering two factors, on the one hand, once Pokrovsk falls, once Kupiansk falls, in those regions the strong, deep fortifications disappear, which means they could now advance in depth much more easily. And secondly, to carry out an offensive on Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, two large urban conglomerations, they would have to engage in urban combat. And urban combat necessarily entails a certain number of casualties. And Russia, increasingly, as you just pointed out, is readjusting its tactics and strategy within the framework of a war of attrition, aiming to inflict as many casualties as possible on the Ukrainian side, while at the same time preserving its own forces and soldiers. That's why in Bakhmut, I remember, a bloodbath, Putin cleverly commissioned the Wagner Group, sending them to take part in the brutal hand-to-hand combat in the city, while Russian troops remained positioned around it. But since Wagner's disappearance and the incorporation of a large part of its personnel into the Russian armed forces, instead of launching a new offensive on the city from the start, they basically create an operational encirclement around it until the city surrenders on its own. Maybe they could do something like that, instead of pounding Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, achieving victory sooner or later, but with heavy losses as well, right?
Indeed, that is to say, the Russians, as happens in all wars in general, and in a war that, let's not forget, is about to enter its 4th year, meaning that's no small thing. The First World War lasted about 4 years, more or less. So it's no trivial matter. The Russians are learning. And besides, the war itself is changing. At the beginning of the war there were drones, but they weren't essential, neither on the Ukrainian side nor on the Russian side. They were just another element of the war. Right now, drones have become the key factor. Last Friday, on the show I did here with Demoliendo Mitos, we watched a video where it looked like the place was full of bumblebees, but they weren't bumblebees. They were drones everywhere, flying across. So you realize you can't go out. That is, the moment you step out of the trench, the bunker, or the basements of the houses, which are essential in this war, and try to do anything, to move forward, a drone comes right at you, one or several, because it's just impossible. That is to say, right now let's not forget that these drones on the front line, not the ones that attack deep inside enemy territory, the ones on the front line have a range of about 30 kilometers on each side, both the Ukrainian and the Russian ones. 30 kilometers is a lot of distance. So, look. These are drones. In Pokrovsk too, look, we can almost count them. And now they're going to appear on the other side. Who can go out there? The moment someone steps out, they're detected and targeted. We're no longer talking about a tank. Well, they don't even consider that anymore. In fact, the number of tanks the Russians had on the front line has gone down. And why has it gone down? Well, among other reasons, because they're no longer useful. What for? So they can be destroyed? No. You can use them as mobile artillery, that is, as self-propelled artillery. But we're seeing the same thing with armored personnel carriers and so on. That's not a problem because they're slow, they're heavy, and drones go after them. In fact, we also saw a video I shared, though there are plenty, where we see how both Russian and Ukrainian troops first deployed motorcycle units, remember, as another type of assault force, because riding a motorcycle lets you move much faster and also make sharp turns to avoid drones. Then we got into the buggies, those four-wheeled buggies that bounce around. And now what we see are Mad Max-style cars. Well, not exactly, but let's say regular cars that have been modified, fitted with bars and such for the drones, because even a regular car, a sedan, performs better and faster than... And well, when traveling on a road, we often see drones attacking cars. And why do drones attack cars? Because both sides are using cars, since they're better for moving around than traditional trucks or heavy armored vehicles. They're faster. So, notice how that change in warfare is fundamental.
In the vast majority of drone images showing destroyed vehicles, in the cases of heavier vehicles you can see pickup trucks, Toyota Hilux, Ford Ranger, otherwise ATVs, or, well, the other day you showed those stripped-down cars, without doors, also used for jumping at the moment of drone impact, and enduro motorcycles, off-road motorcycles. But the crazy thing about all this, Fernando, is that even so, despite the greater speed and mobility, the drones still manage to hit all those vehicles too.
It's incredible, because you've already seen how dense the drone battlefield is. It's like flies, and some even lie on the ground and wait for something to pass. And of course, under those conditions, it's very hard to move forward. The solution the Russians have come up with for this, maybe the Ukrainians are saying the same thing, but anyway, the one the Russians have adopted has completely abandoned the idea of advancing with large numbers of troops or launching large-scale attacks. What we're seeing now are small units because they're single units of 2 to 4 soldiers with a specific target. They're sent to a certain location in coordination with another 2 or 4 soldiers somewhere else and another group somewhere else and so on. But they advance, in many cases, in pairs. And we see them moving forward in pairs and sometimes even one by one.
Bueno, y a veces está de uno en uno, pero vamos, es decir, que, ¿por qué? Porque es la única manera de que la
But come on, I mean, why? Because it's the only way to reduce the drone's ability to take out soldiers. Because the moment you gather, say, a company of 150 or so, no, the moment you gather 10 soldiers, that's more visible than anything else. And then obviously the drones go after those groups. And this is crucial, just as we're seeing that in the countryside, advances are always made along those lines of trees that mark the edges of the fields. And in urban environments, it's house by house, trying to make the distance between houses as small as possible. Because the moment you step into open ground, or in this case, an open city, you've got a drone that'll crush you. We're seeing drones that are already coming in from everywhere, into the buildings.
Drones que ya entran por todos los sitios, en los edificios. Porque como son drones pequeñitos, pueden entrar por ventanas,
because since they're tiny drones, they can come in through windows, from anywhere. And inside, they even go down hallways and enter rooms. I mean, they search. It's true, this is a full-on Terminator situation. I mean, drones of all sizes chasing you wherever you go. And about them chasing you, the other day you showed that Ukrainian military operation with Black Hawk helicopters that landed. You can see it in the footage. Well, not much of it can be shown, but still, you can see it in that gray tone of night vision cameras and so on. And you can see how they go after the soldiers one by one, the drones, and take them out, even some who had reached residential areas. So it's the same thing, really. And that's what we're seeing. That's why it's so hard for either side, for both combatants to make progress.
Initially, Fernando, the response from both sides to the drones seemed tied to electronic warfare. Of course, all sides still make use of electronic warfare, but amid that back and forth, that head-to-head struggle between drones and electronic warfare against drones, suddenly wired drones appeared.
Yes, it's a thing.
They can attack the drones with electronic warfare through the cable, and they travel several dozen kilometers connected by that cable.
An unheard of thing, because they're controlled by cables, as you rightly point out, made of fiber optics. And fiber optics, of course, are immune to electronic warfare interference. And the skill of the drone operators is tremendous, to the point that we see them flying through forests where normally the cable would get tangled and it would be impossible. But no, they weave between trees and so on, and they catch the soldier on duty. It's quite extraordinary. It must be said that both Ukrainians and Russians are fully committed to training and forming units of drone operators. That is, now when you're on the battlefield, your main target is no longer that tank over there or the soldiers advancing over here. No, it's figuring out where the enemy's drone operators are so you can take them out to launch your drones against those operators who are controlling these drones. Because let's not forget, all these drones are controlled by operators who may sometimes be far away but who are generally around the battlefield. And there are two ways to control these drones. One, with a screen, let's say, like an iPad, a kind of tablet. Sorry, not an iPad, I mean a tablet where you control the drone with a joystick and so on. And then there are others that basically put the screen inside the goggles. They give you a kind of special immersive glasses. Exactly. And you see the same thing the drone sees, because all drones have a camera. So these operators who are in frontline areas have become the main targets of attacks from both sides, because they're key, meaning taking them out is crucial. And well, this is what we're seeing, hence the significance of the Russian advance. People often say, no, the Russians are moving very slowly. Yes, they are indeed moving slowly, but it's impossible to go fast. It's very difficult. The war has changed dramatically over these 4 years.
Estas imágenes
brutalmente
del
en
día
estos
de
4 años.
hoy. Fernando,
Sí,
esto
perdona.
publicado el día de hoy, vos hace un
Fíjate.
rato, si no recuerdo mal,
Fernando, you posted today. You, a little while ago if I'm not mistaken, made a mention of these images released today. Attention. Yes, for example, what is this? A bush, a 50-ton bush. Pay attention to this. Yes, it's incredible. Go ahead with the mine rollers.
rodillos, adelante con los rodillos
Sí,
antiminas.
los antiminas. Y sabemos que es un tanque porque vemos el cañón.
Anti-mines. And we know it's a tank because we can see the cannon. Otherwise, this could be anything, because you can clearly see the tank's cannon sticking out. This is done not only for camouflage, but also because the drone explodes as soon as it touches something. So if it's covered with anything, those drones will crash into this sort of giant bush and explode before reaching the tank's armor. And we're talking about a tank here. Imagine lighter vehicles. Anyway, we're seeing this all the time, these camouflages, just like all those nets and other things placed over all kinds of vehicles to prevent direct hits. And well, as we were saying here, come on. Yes, I'm rambling on and on. Can't be. Oh my God, let's go here.
No puede ser. Es decir, ay, Dios mío. Vamos aquí. Vamos a Pokrovsk, que es la clave. Siempre hemos hablado de que...
Let's go to Pokrovsk, which is the key. We've always said that once Pokrovsk is taken, things are going to change a lot, and that has already happened. As you know, Pokrovsk has a sister city, let's say it's Zinigrad, which is practically right next to it. That is, they're not the same city, not by a long shot. Anyway, two elongated cities, so to speak. Pokrovsk is a bit more rounded in quotes, just to give you an idea, but more centralized. As noted there, it's more elongated, as Ezekiel clearly shows, and as you can see, Pokrovsk has already fallen. That is what still remains in some areas, especially in the north. Let's say what the Russians have done, to put it simply, is advance from the south toward the north, basically. They've been moving forward, and especially this October, the advance has been very fast.
Han ido avanzando y sobre todo en este mes de octubre el avance ha sido muy rápido. ¿Por qué? Porque en Pokrovsk han tenido gravísimos problemas.
Why? Because in Pokrovsk they've had extremely serious problems. In fact, in recent weeks there were no longer coordinated units forming any kind of front line, but rather scattered units acting more or less on their own. That is, since they no longer had the ability to maintain a front or a defensive line, they were defending areas, zones, as best they could. And here you can clearly see that what remains are minimal parts in the gray zone. The gray zone is an area where the Russians are already present. What's happening is that they're clearing it of Ukrainian units. This last stage of the battle in Pokrovsk has seen many Russian advances, as we've seen. Advances by small Russian groups. Ezekiel points them out in red. Those two areas that remain gray and are currently being eliminated. That is to say, the battle for Pokrovsk is over. Now we'll see more developments, because this still has a long way to go. And this is a key city. When they finish clearing these gray areas, what we're going to see is, well, first, there's always a period, let's say, to clear the zones, to eliminate the small pockets of resistance. 1 soldier here, 3 soldiers there, meaning those who might still remain. And once that cleanup is done, we'll see some advances that we'll talk about later. What's also happening is that in this sister city, there's a bridge here, not a real bridge, a small town called Rivne. There you can see it, which serves as the link, so to speak, between Pokrovsk and Mirnograd.
Entre Pokrovsk y Mirnograd. Esta pequeña población, por eso digo que es prácticamente están.
This small town, well, that's why I say they're practically connected. So they're going to go for it right after they finish the cleanup in Pokrovsk. But at the same time, what we're seeing is that they're mainly advancing from east to west, that is, from the eastern to the western part of the city. And they've already taken areas in the north, as I said, along this entire line we see here in the east. And what the latest reports we have say that the disorganization is significant.
Las últimas noticias que tenemos es que la desorganización es grande. Se intentaba, lo que intentaban los ucranianos es mantener.
What the Ukrainians were trying to do was to hold on as much as possible, or resist for a certain amount of time, in the southern part of this city, allowing the units in the north to withdraw in quotes, and therefore for the units in the south of the city to fall back in a more or less orderly manner. This is always very difficult for any army to do, and of course the problem they have is that once Pokrovsk and Leibniz were taken, and also from the north, as we can see here, from this city they have been advancing, cutting off logistics, and the distance between the red zones, as we can see there, between the red zones and Pokrovsk, also in the red zone, is about 2 kilometers. That is that area over there, a very narrow area, which has been getting even narrower over time, and that's where the Ukrainian units have to get out however they can. Since there are no roads left, good or bad, they have to go cross-country. Of course, they leave behind all the equipment they have. That is, heavy equipment. If you have a cannon, you leave it there. If you have a tank, same thing. Even cars or motorcycles are no longer useful to them. So, on foot, and however you can. And as I said, 1 by 1, 2 by 2, because otherwise the drones, which are flying all over the place right now, will catch you. And at night, they have better chances. So, well, they're trying to get out.
The
news we have is that drones, along with artillery, are wiping out many of those units, those, well, soldiers who are trying to escape this encirclement. And this obviously is over. In other words, there's no longer any organized resistance from the Ukrainians in this area. It's just an attempt to leave Minograd however they can and try to stay alive. And we're seeing the same thing again. This isn't new. We saw it in Bakhmut. We saw it in many places, in Atrabiska as well. That is, holding out to the end in something that makes no sense whatsoever from a military standpoint. A soldier must know perfectly well when an area is indefensible, and therefore the most logical thing in those cases, when you have a city or a region, whatever it may be, that's indefensible, is not to sacrifice soldiers you can't afford to lose. That is to say, you have few. Not at all. It makes no sense. That's what the military and General Sirki, the chief of the Ukrainian General Staff, are doing, under orders from President Zelensky and company. And they're doing this not for a military reason, which, as I said, makes no sense, but for a political one, to delay bad news as long as possible so that Mr. Zelensky and company can keep selling the idea that they're still holding on. So that when he travels to the United States, or some European Union country, he can keep up the narrative that we can win. While in the meantime, there we see it, he's sacrificing poor soldiers. Some of them, as you can see, not exactly young.
They surrendered intelligently. Therefore, indeed, preserving their lives was the smartest decision. According to reports from those who publicly shared these videos, these soldiers had been abandoned by their commanding officer, by their superiors. They were left behind, and at that moment they decided to surrender. Quite rightly so. There was no sense in giving up their lives in vain for someone who had abandoned them. Well, this is the situation. This is the report. This video, once again, courtesy of our sister channel, Wars and Geopolitics. So please everyone, follow that Telegram channel of course, with truly excellent quality information in Spanish. The faces of these poor people.
Everyone says it. Notice that we're not talking about kids or young people between 25 and 30 or 35. Many of them aren't even 50 yet. I mean, well, those ones already are.
Fernando, the crazy ultranationalists, the Azov people, did they take part in the first year of the war, the second year, or are they maybe still in the special forces groups? The thing is, these people, the ones rounded up off the streets, thrown into those vans, and sent to the front with barely a couple of days of training, used as cannon fodder, they're not even people committed to this madness, but victims from every side.
Y además con muy pocos tiempos de preparación, una semana.
And besides, with very little preparation time, sometimes just a week. Basically, they teach you how to fire a rifle, and that's about it. Well, they're sending them there, and of course they do what they can from a military standpoint. But in such catastrophic situations where there's nothing left to do, it makes no sense to keep fighting. But as I said before, the problem here lies with the commanders. The issue is that, for political and propaganda reasons, to sell a certain narrative to the West in order to get money from Europeans now, since the Americans are giving little, first from the Europeans, before that from the Americans, from Biden. What they're doing is holding out, as we've seen, to the very end, defending indefensible cities that are already surrounded and have no capacity for defense. This is causing all kinds of casualties, that is, within the Ukrainian army. And it makes no sense.
Well, speaking of nonsense, what's your interpretation of the nonsense behind the commando operation carried out yesterday by the Ukrainian Special Forces, known as GUR, G-U-R, on the outskirts of Pokrovsk? What's the explanation for that from a military point of view, from a tactical point of view? Please.
Well, as we're seeing, as I mentioned before, large numbers of soldiers are no longer being used to take a city, but rather small units that infiltrate. And maybe in the Battle of Pokrovsk, toward the end it was said that about 250 Russian soldiers were advancing into the city, and the defenders were an equal or smaller number. It depended on the sectors. Well, what they were trying to do with this was, it seems that each of them had 2 helicopters. There were Black Hawks, there were Mi-8s. We have full footage of one of them. The other we only see briefly. At least that's what I've seen. Well, what they were trying to do was delay the advance of these small Russian units and in theory open a small gap so that Ukrainian units could get out. But it still makes no sense because we're talking about an extremely risky operation in which you're not sending enough soldiers to create, let's say, a gap, a corridor for troops to get out, let alone to get in. So, well, I don't see any sense in it. I mean, it's a desperate move. Well, decisions get made. Indeed.
That they don't have the most absolute desperation.
Of course, you know that for this operation to go well, there has to be a lot of luck. Really a lot. They've already been quite lucky that, as far as we know, the helicopters haven't been shot down. But of course, the soldiers didn't leave a single one behind. Also, as we were saying before, if the drones don't let you go unnoticed, it's hard enough for a soldier to go unnoticed. Just imagine 2 Black Hawks coming in. That's why we have footage of the 2 Black Hawks flying, arriving, and one of them landing, because they were already being tracked by the drones, which waited for the soldiers to disembark there, so they could take them out one by one.
We presented it yesterday, but we can show the videos again, because of how spectacular they are, and as an example of the desperation of the Ukrainian High Command in committing such madness, launching operations of this kind, with the cream of the crop, with the best of their special forces.
The course, let's say, of military intelligence and special forces, that is, the people supposedly most committed to the cause.
Luganov, in charge of the operation from nearby, from Pavlovka. This is the video they initially released. There.
The helicopters have already landed there. We can see how they spread out. Notice how quickly each one moves almost independently. Why? To avoid the drones. They advance toward the field, and the helicopter, we can see it there, takes off and leaves. That means we're not talking about something like what we saw in Mariupol at the time. Desperate helicopters trying to rescue officers, high-ranking Western officers. This operation doesn't seem to be for that, because the helicopters leave, and it would be madness to expect these soldiers to locate those high-ranking officers, grab them, and reconnect with the helicopter to pick them up. It seems absurd to me.
Conectaran otra vez con el helicóptero para recogerlos. Me parece un disparate. Es decir, esto en una guerra actual.
That is to say, in a current war, this involves just a few of those soldiers, a small group. By the way, I want to show the map first. I wanted the map with the images again, but I couldn't, so here's this simpler one. Initially, in this special and media-driven operation, the Ukrainian armed forces and the Western media presented this as an operation in Pokrovsk, in a way as a kind of rebuttal of Russian control over Pokrovsk. But in the end, intelligence analysts determined that they had actually landed on the outskirts of Pokrovsk, apparently somewhere around here. Those soldiers moved around once they were scattered there, apparently from, well, I might be mistaken about the exact location, because this map doesn't show the icons with precise positioning, but roughly the landing site would be around here.
Exacto, pero más o menos el lugar de descenso por aquí y un grupito una vez descendidos por aquí.
And a small group, once they came down here, basically followed this route, and another took this other route to some small houses, a building over here. This last little group, in fact, recorded this video shortly before being eliminated. We're showing it here as an example of the siege against anything that moves. Pay attention to this, Fernando, to this video here. The video, good. Everything showing up clearly there. Yes, despite the technical difficulties. Yes, you can see it there. Look, this is the entrance. Oh, by the way, this one. Yes, this one with the black and red flag, Fernando. These are Ukrainian nationalists. Yes, nationalists.
Of course, no. These people committed to the cause, as they say, yes, yes, yes.
Remember this, demolishers. Any Ukrainian with the red and black flag. A Nazi, basically. Because that's the flag of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, collaborators with the Nazis and the SS Galicia, responsible for the Volhynia massacre, indeed. Indeed, and for the death of many Ukrainians who fought against the Nazis in World War II. All of this during World War II, obviously. Here's the video, Fernando. Destroyed houses, that place, the door closed. And pay attention, from now on. Fernando, we're going to count together.
Ruido de dron. Ruido de cuadricóptero. Primero.
Are you okay?
Bien escuchable la hélice.
Yes.
You can see it there. That green ink they wear is typical of the higher units, so they can recognize each other.
There it goes. Mark, attack, and almost through the window. Trying, that's possibly conventional artillery, judging by the sound.
Are they succeeding?
There's an explosion nearby.
There it goes. Another one. Look, they can come at you from anywhere.
And the ceiling is practically giving in. The ceiling, yes, yes, yes.
In fact, there are walls that no longer exist, and there's a huge gap.
Well, there are the images released by these people, clearly connected live. Shortly after that, this is the only group with the possibility of entering one of these houses and a so-called fortification. All the others couldn't even do that. And here's the video released a short time later, this time by the Russians, showing the fate of these fighters, the fate of these special units, confirmed shortly afterward by the deep state itself, through the pro-Ukrainian channel par excellence. Here in this video, at first there's a small piece of the original Ukrainian video, and then shortly after the images of this.
You can see it there.
Thermal cameras, the first dead, another one. There are 3 others in a forest, one there. Behind, there, crouching. Another one here, one wounded, and the other helping him. Bang. And this one, obviously, in that house we just saw. Through the window.
Look how the drone moves between the rooms.
It's tremendous. He gets in through a window, through that hole we saw in the wall. There's just no possible escape. I mean, besides, what's the point of sending these elite soldiers on a mission that makes absolutely no sense? Well, there are two versions. One says 11 soldiers, the other says 15. It doesn't matter, 11 or 15. What did they want? To create an escape route against the entire Russian armed forces. And besides, at best, they managed to go about 200 meters to a house, made a video, and got crushed there. The others didn't even get that far.
Well, yes. I'm afraid, you see, that this is another propaganda operation in which, since they have no scruples, they sacrifice soldiers to make a video and say, we're still here, resisting in Pokrovsk, even our units are landing there, and sell the idea that Pokrovsk is still in Ukrainian hands. Something like that. It doesn't make sense otherwise. I mean, it's for publicity. Mind you, Zelensky, I don't know if that's changed already, but until a little while ago, when we started, Zelensky and company were still saying that Pokrovsk wasn't in Russian hands, that it was in Ukrainian hands and so on, and that there were no problems, that everything was stable.
And the other statement at that press conference, according to Zelensky, was that last year they had carried out the destruction of Oryechnik missiles in a commando operation. Delusional. Yes, yes, me too. Before the presentation. Yes, yes, yes.
And every weekend before the show, I go destroy a few nuclear missiles. Well, I mean, but come on, yeah, in dreams, obviously. But look, it doesn't make any sense, because another thing that's been speculated is that it was meant to stop or slow down the Russians' advance toward a small town called Hersny, more or less, which is right next to, almost at Prokhorovka, but already outside the encirclement, and that the Russians are advancing along the road toward that city. But still, I mean, you don't see the logic beyond the publicity logic of selling some images saying, see how we're here.
I also read a version saying that these 15 elite soldiers wanted to plant the Ukrainian flag at a symbolic spot. You'll remember those typical signs in Ukraine and many Eastern European countries. When you enter a city, there's a big sign, usually with letters made of reinforced concrete, very Soviet style, very rustic. Well, there's a sign there with the name of the town. And in front of that spot, Zelensky himself, in front of the Pokrovsk sign, had taken a photo months earlier. The Russians captured it, raised their flag, and then a rain of Ukrainian drones began. About 6 drones wasted trying to blow up that flag from a distance, obviously. Maybe they wanted something like that, to raise the Ukrainian flag in some symbolic place.
Maybe, because of course, if what you want is publicity, and you don't mind sacrificing people, well then you do it to take the picture and spread it around. There's something very important I almost forgot to mention. Let's talk about the Rubicon. And this man, he's really out of his mind, is not going to talk about Julius Caesar crossing the famous Rubicon River and saying the die is cast and all that. No, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm crazy, but not that crazy. There's a Russian unit called Rubicon. So what does this unit do? Well, this unit is the elite of the Russian elite in drone operations. They're the best. So they've deployed this unit there, and they're the ones operating the drones. They have extraordinary effectiveness. You can see the lists of destroyed targets they publish, and as I said, it's an extraordinary drone operator unit, the best the Russians have. Moreover, they don't just focus on eliminating Ukrainian fighters. They also have an experimental component where new drone attack techniques and new models are tested. In other words, the best of the best. Well, around Rubicon, people were talking more and more about them because, as I said, they're the elite of the elite in this field. They were there, taken to Pokrovsk, and there they are attacking, as you can see, with drones, eliminating everything that moves. And as I said, the operation only serves that publicity purpose.
Solo tiene ese sentido publicitario, pues eso, lo que tú dices, hacerte la foto, poner una bandera.
Well, that's it, what you're saying. Take the photo, put up a flag, show the soldiers there, and so on. But really, this means nothing. It's useless. So, what are you trying to sell? To Westerners that Pokrovsk hasn't fallen yet, or something like that? Well, then you make a video somewhere else. Who can tell the difference between one of those destroyed houses in Pokrovsk or anywhere else? I mean, you sell it, like they've done many times, and you sell it as if it were Pokrovsk. But, as I said, the operation makes no sense whatsoever. The only thing is, as I said, you're not going to achieve anything. You're using too few soldiers to carry out any kind of operation.
Luckily, they were able to make the flight with the Black Hawks without being shot down. Because if, on top of this whole disaster, the Black Hawks had been shot down, supposedly, the United States hadn't dispatched any Black Hawk helicopters, and now suddenly, this surprise. So, Budanov, the Berg troops, the Black Hawks, everything that represents the best of the Ukrainian forces there for this disaster. Good thing we didn't witness the downing of a Black Hawk.
Yes, because on top of that, with the famous movie Black Hawk Down, from then on came the memes, the publicity. Anyway, tremendous. But well, what you're pointing out is very important, isn't it? It's yet another piece of evidence that what we're told in the West is at best incomplete. Because they say, no, we have Leopards. Sure, yes, they do have Leopard tanks, we've seen them many times and all that. But they have things, they're given things to the Ukrainians that we're not told about. Like these Black Hawks, which we've only just found out they have, because of this operation. Otherwise, we'd have no idea. And let's not forget, the Black Hawk is an American helicopter. I'm not sure right now which European countries might have it, but either the Americans gave it to them, or some country that also has them did. In the end, we realize they have more Western weaponry than we're told about, more than we usually see, and that helicopters, in Ukraine's case, face enormous difficulty moving anything that flies. Well, they brought them out for this bizarre and ridiculous operation, which cost them an elite unit and could even have cost them the loss of the helicopters. It makes no sense. But indeed, that is to say, they'll surely keep surprising us from time to time when we see some weapon, helicopters or whatever, that they supposedly don't have, but actually do. It's what we've been saying for a while. Every time they started with this, now we're sending tanks, now planes, yes, no, maybe we'll send them, all of that was pure theater. They had already sent them. The thing is, they had to put on this little show about how the Germans didn't want to, the French did, the Americans forbade it, and so on. Now they say yes, now they say no. All of this was pure theater, and many of these weapons were already in Ukraine, just waiting for the green light to enter combat. That's what happened with the planes, with the tanks, the Leopards, the Abrams, and so on. It's happened with everything, with all the weapon systems, where they've always been playing the same game. Well, okay, let's calm down. We won't give them. Well, yes, we will give them. These missiles, yes, but not those. Until in the end, it always turned out the same way. All right, fine, we'll send them. We've seen this thousands of times already. And now, well, they've surprised us with the Black Hawks. Let's see what they surprise us with next.
una situación, no olvidemos que los europeos muertos de pánico, pues
In a situation like this, let's not forget that the Europeans, scared to death, because they really are scared to death right now, are also desperate, trying to figure out what to do so their whole setup in Ukraine doesn't collapse. Because, as we'll see now, what the Ukrainians have done, apart from trying these far-fetched maneuvers and so on, and those who are trapped trying to get out of this pocket however they can, is already anticipating, well, already knowing, that Pokrovsk and Minigrad are going to fall, and that it was only a matter of days, and that, well, however long it takes them to capture Minigrad and carry out a cleanup, so to speak, of this whole pocket. The next step, once Pokrovsk is taken, which at one time was a very important logistical hub for Ukrainian troops, though it no longer is, but it remains Ukraine's last major stronghold. From that point on, there are no longer those systems of trenches, those massive fortifications with bunkers that have been built since 2014. And it has cost the Russians an enormous effort, because getting through all that has taken, well, practically 4 years.
Pasar todo esto, pues fíjate, 4 años prácticamente, es decir, ¿por qué? Porque era una línea tras otra, es decir...
That is to say, why? Because it was one line after another. Tremendous systems of trenches, fortifications, bunkers, minefields, and so on had been built. And you had to get through one line, then another, and that took a lot of time. Well, that's over now. In this area, in this sector, it's practically over. Once they clear Pokrovsk and Minigrad, from that point on there are very few fortifications of that kind left. In fact, what were the Ukrainians doing? They were sending troops, not to try to liberate the city, which is impossible, but rather to try to stabilize the front from a certain distance. Once the Russians have taken Pokrovsk, when they continue their advance, they'll try to slow it down however they can. And they were digging trenches, literally. That is, right now they're digging trenches to see what they can do quickly, in emergency mode, in anticipation of the Russians' future advance. And they have nothing, because on top of that, and we've talked about this many times, the tremendous corruption in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian army, and so on, well, they'd send a commander and tell him, build some trenches in such and such a place. And then they'd come by later and say, where are the trenches? There are no trenches here, no fortifications, nothing. Turns out the commander or the town's mayor had pocketed the money, for example.
That is to say, the result of that. Fernando, let's wrap up the analysis. Yes, because there are still some things left. Or did you still want to present something, whatever you prefer?
Yes, here very quickly at least, but because it's that, with the map, yes. Because if this is already, it's fundamental. From now on, the advance toward the west is going to be much faster. There's actually a place where the westward advance is already spectacular, which is precisely in Dnipropetrovsk. And further south, on the administrative border between Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia, there toward Huliai-Pole, they're advancing at a dizzying speed. Why? Because of what we talked about earlier, there's nothing left, no fortifications. They're coming across small villages where the Ukrainians defend themselves as best they can, but there are no longer any front lines. And there we can see it, it looks very clear. Look, this incoming force we see in a darker red color is right now about to cut, well, less than a kilometer away, one of the main supply roads to Huliai-Pole, which is crucial for the defense of Zaporizhia, for what remains of Zaporizhia. Well, at this moment they're already at the outskirts of a small village called Danilivka, or something like that. And there they can already make a major cut to this north-south road.
A little lower.
Exactly. Once they've cut through here, they'll move toward Pokrovsk, not to be confused with Pokrovsk, which has a similar name, meaning it's a key logistical road hub, since it has roads going north, south, east, and west. But above all, Huliai-Pole is crucial. The two major defensive strongholds the Ukrainians have in Zaporizhia, what's left of Zaporizhia, are Orikiv and Huliaipolo. Well, in Huliaipolo, they're advancing very quickly. Look, there was a river line, I never remember, there's a river here, I'll tell you in a moment, that served as a defensive line, with settlements along it, which is roughly the Yanchur River. You know, the river was wide, and there was a whole series of small towns, one after another, forming a defensive line. Well, this is over, because the only one left is Uspeniska, and they've already taken half of Uspeniska. That is, and on the other side of the river. So they're going to finish taking it today, tomorrow, or the day after. And from there, we're already seeing in advance that even that river that keeps going down, and this river, there you have it. No, this river, well, yes, wait, it goes down. I mean, there are some things, goes down, as if it could go up. Further south here, you'll see in the area, there it is, along that line.
What is the name of the town?
Uspenivka, it's the only one left. They're advancing there very quickly.
Do you see her?
Here it is. No, farther south. Here's this little town, and now go through the red area. Yeah, head south.
It is.
No. This is another one. It's just that they have the same name. You see, there are a lot of towns and cities in Ukraine with the same name. No, look, by that river, the Yanchur, heading south, way down south. There, keep going down. There, do you see that? There? There's a, there. Further down there, that's Uspenivka, a red area. Ah!
What knowledge of the map, Fernando? From memory, remember. What a genius.
No, it's not by chance. I mean, on top of that, they even have the same name, so sometimes I've had to add names because they were close to each other, and they'd say, well, Upper Uspenivka and Lower Uspenivka. Why? Because, I don't know, they have the same name. But anyway. Yes, to tell them apart, because there's no other way. Well, this is the last bit that's left. They've crossed the river, they've taken Pibilene, all these areas, Novomihailivka, all these towns have already been taken. Only part of Uspenivka remains, and from now on, as you can see on the map, what's there? Fields. Countryside, and a few lost villages here and there. But villages, meaning just 4 houses. And this advance, look how it's already moved forward, and how the Russians are advancing toward Mariupol to do the same thing again, encircle them. That is, here we have Mariupol, they're advancing, they've cut or are about to cut this logistics and communication line that supplied them from north to south. And if they keep advancing, they'll surround it. And what will they do then? Cut the other logistics line from Mariupol that supplies them from Zaporizhia. In other words, we're going to see this happen very quickly because the advance is very fast.
Esto lo vamos a ver muy rápido porque el avance es muy rápido. Es que si nos fijamos, hace poco más de un año.
If you think about it, just a little over a year ago, 1 year and 1 month, we were talking about the capture of Uladar. Remember? A fortress the Russians had tried to take 3 times and had failed. Well then, 3 or 4 times, yes, 3 or 4 times. Well, they took it. And the advance that's happened here is spectacular in terms of major positions. Why? Because there are no longer enough men to hold a front line, and what you're finding are units defending individual towns. So you can advance very quickly.
I don't even remember where on the map, somewhere.
No, you have to go. You have to go, but come on, to the depths of the red zone. I mean, just so you get an idea, look, somewhere down here, I'm looking at a map here too, trying to find it. And Endones, Mariupol, Ugledar, look there, well. Yes, it's in the, let's say, lighter red area, lost there in the abyssal depths of the Russian zone. Well, all of this has been gained this year, along with some very important conquests, such as, here I have it, let's see, because this, as I said, is tremendous. How was it? Let's see, no, it was Novomihailivka, for example, I think it was. So, well, all of this and the push into Dnipropetrovsk, which a few months ago we were saying, no, they've taken the first village in Dnipropetrovsk on the administrative border. Well, now look how they're starting to advance.
Yes, 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 I remember.
And we were saying, no, well, it's a village they've taken there on the border and so on. They're already in Dnipro. Well, they're not just in Dnipro, there's already about 30 kilometers of penetration or more. And as I said, the advance here is very fast because there's just nothing left. I mean, they've tried some local counterattacks, but things just can't go any further. So, well, from now on, we're going to see quite rapid advances, a sort of race, let's say, toward the Dnipro. That is a race to the west. Look, we can already see the Dnipro there. It's far, but not that far, and now under different conditions. That is to say, we've already finished with that endless war of trenches and fortifications. And now, what we have here is a much lower population density. Small towns, villages, a few cities, and one key city. But that will be for next year. It'll take time. We'll see how things progress, which is Pavlograd, the major logistical hub that supplies the entire front. It's somewhere in between Dnipro and the front line. Around there, there's a place called Pavlograd, which is the only city here. You'll see it there. That is Pavlograd toward Dnipro.
Toward Dnipro. Toward Dnipro, he led the operation.
Of course, from there I also command the operations, from a good distance.
Let's see, Pavlograd is... Let's see, let me give you a hint.
It's closer to kind of halfway difficult. That's why the other one wanted it. But, oh well.
Yeah, it's closer to the river now.
Closer to Pavlograd, more around here.
Closer to Dnipro. It's right, let me see how I can explain it. Imagine the city of Dnipro, the capital. Well, this is kind of in a straight line, a bit higher up, just a little higher, but almost in a straight line to the east. Around here? Yes, exactly around here. Here, here, here.
There he goes, there he goes.
Well, this is the major logistical hub that supplies the entire front line, from Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk. Practically, this whole large area is supplied from here. This isn't a target for now or for tomorrow, but once they start advancing, this is the main objective. And if they reach this point, all of Zaporizhia, all of Dnipro, and possibly more would fall into Russian hands. The entire southern bank of the Dnipro, the eastern bank of the Dnipro, would fall into Russian hands. And as I said, from now on, we're going to see a different kind of war, in which the Ukrainians no longer have fortified front lines. What they have are units that will try to defend themselves as best they can in small towns. And this makes it easier for the Russians to advance, and it will depend more on their logistics. That is, for example, Pokrovsk. Now, what the Russians are going to do, once they finish clearing it, is rebuild the logistical part that interests them, so that Pokrovsk serves as a logistical hub for them to send units toward a front advancing westward. Well, that's what they're going to do now with Pokrovsk. As soon as they have it conquered and cleared of soldiers, they will re-establish the logistical lines and the roads that the Ukrainians previously used to reach the front. Now the Russians will use them to advance toward Pavlograd, to advance toward Zaporizhia, which is farther south on the Dnipro. Let's not forget that in Zaporizhia, the advance they made, a corridor the Russians gradually opened along the Dnipro, means the city isn't very far away, maybe about 30 kilometers. That is to say, we could very well see a collapse in this area, quite severe, of the Ukrainian troops, who lack manpower, who have no defenses, and who are now extremely worried because the Russians can advance here quite quickly. The only thing holding the Russians back is the drone war. In other words, if this drone war didn't exist, the Russians would already be advancing very fast right now. What's slowing them down are the drones. But of course, the disadvantage keeps growing.
Tell me.
Yes, as we already started on our channel, together with MP Geopolitics, Santiago Martinez's program, we're going to present one last topic and wrap up this broadcast. Your choice, Fernando. By the way, how are the likes doing? We just had 3,800 demolishers connected, 2,600 likes, more than 1,000 likes short, 1,000 fewer than we should have. Demolishers, please help us out with a thumbs up. Fernando, to close, we can. Obviously, we can't cover everything. Either present the introduction of the Khabarovsk submarine in Russia, which is responsible for carrying the Poseidon torpedo. We could show your best friend Kaja Kallas talking about democracy in Ukraine. Maria Corina Machado, with the Nobel Peace Prize winner, calling for peace and unity among Venezuelans. Or actually quite the opposite. Or even good old, or not so good, J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, dressed up for Halloween. Or also over here, in our Meanwhile in China section. Oh no, sorry, this one's in Tokyo. Oh wait, we won't be able to do this one. The auto show, the Tokyo Motor Show, but with Chinese brands as the main attraction. But that one we won't be able to show. Of the others, which one do you want? Kaja Kallas, Maria Corina Machado, or J.D. Vance in costume?
Now that I no longer have Nelena Barbuk in Europe, to me, Kaja Kallas honestly seems like one of the most disgraceful figures in Europe right now. I mean, it's worth seeing what nonsense this medicist says. But well, those are just my personal preferences.
Yes. I'm figuring out your taste when it comes to women and love, and you're drawn to Nordic women, from Central Europe upward. Dominant ones, who like to take charge. Viking women. Yes. Over here, Kaja Kallas, dear Fernando, pay attention.
Well, just to say that the Khabarovsk, meanwhile... Let's see. No, simply to say that it's the second submarine. They already launched one that's operational, the Belgorod, which can carry the Poseidon torpedoes, those nuclear ones. Well, now they've just launched the second one called Khabarovsk.
Kaja Kallas on Putin and democracy in Ukraine.
With corrupt, weak institutions.
There are two ways. There's the journalist's question. There are two ways Putin can win, either through military force, or if Ukraine becomes a failed democracy.
And now good Kaja is going to respond. Yes, because we're taking into account that Ukraine wants to be a member of the European Union. They don't get any discount when it comes to...
Yes, exactly. Let's remember that Ukraine wants to join the European Union, and we're not giving it any special treatment. We're imposing all the requirements regarding the necessary reforms for its entry into the European Union.
Reforms and fighting corruption. Russia is...
Reforms and the fight against corruption. Russia is not...
We are also establishing greater transparency in the fight against corruption in Ukraine.
Afraid or has never been afraid.
Wink, wink.
It's impossible to imagine what they are concerned.
Russians aren't at all afraid of the countries they attack, defending themselves and responding with more attacks. What Russians fear is the expansion of democracy.
That's what the Russians are really afraid of.
Not go to the democratic way because they...
They need the countries around them not to take the democratic path. the path of democracy, because then the Russians themselves, the Russian population, might catch on and start demanding democracy too. In the Roman way, yes. If instead of democracy, it said color revolution. This video is amazing, isn't it? And then comes the journalist's follow-up question.
Completely content with the kind of the state.
Are you satisfied with the state of democracy at this moment? Because we saw protests in front of
Essentially neuter one of the anti-corruption agencies.
in the face of an attempt to neutralize one of the anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine, and we saw protests against this. No, it's definitely not perfect. And also, the events from the summer that you mentioned are very good examples that
No, it's not perfect.
democracy in Ukraine is not perfect, and the events and protests from last summer that you mentioned are a very good example of that.
It's no way perfect, but
Es un ejemplo de que también hay una tendencia hacia una regresión autoritaria.
It's an example that there's also a tendency toward authoritarian regression, but that was neutralized. Democracy isn't perfect, but, forgive me, our European countries, the member states, aren't perfect in terms of democracy either. Respond calmly.
what I'm trying to say is that we are keeping those two.
She's just dumb. She couldn't be any dumber. What I'm trying to say is she got herself into this mess. What I'm trying to say is
Also Russia, who doesn't want the democracy to expand and prosperity.
What I'm trying to say is that a failure of Ukraine's democracy would benefit Russia in its desire to expand and thrive. They want to control that. Well, actually, Fernando, Russia didn't want NATO to set up bases and missiles on its border. They didn't want that, Fernando. We were wrong. They didn't want democracy.
Ellos no querían la democracia.
Claro, es la democracia ejemplar de Rumanía.
Of course, I mean, the exemplary democracy of Romania, for example, this one that's the candidate, indeed those wonderful democracies promoted by the European Union. Or, if I don't like Marine Le Pen, well, I just remove her as a candidate through a judicial process that suspends her and prevents her from running in any election in France for the next 5 years. Well, you know, there's also the internal debate you're perfectly familiar with in Germany, that Alternative for Germany could win. And the best and most democratic thing we can do is to outlaw it so it doesn't win. Those kinds of things you're talking about.
Or better yet, the democracy of Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, the unelected President of Europe. And well, in that case, if I were Russia, I wouldn't want a so-called democracy with someone like Ursula von der Leyen as president of my country either.
What I don't know is whether this woman actually believes the nonsense she says, or if she thinks people will buy into this kind of speech. I mean, even the journalist who's on the same side told me, come on, don't try to sell me that what the Russians fear is democracy, and that the opposite example of democracy is Ukraine. Because if Ukrainian democracy is the model to follow, then the Russians must be thrilled. That so-called democracy has about as much to do with democracy as I have with being a bishop. And as you can see, I'm no bishop. So, this lady couldn't be any dumber. By the way, she's at odds with Ursula von der Leyen, huh? They've had a bit of a clash. Yeah, you've seen it, right? Well, it's a power struggle between them, isn't it? And in the end, Ursula, who's the one in charge, told her off, basically gave her a slap on the wrist, and said, no, we're doing this instead. She wanted to appoint someone from her own circle, Kaja Kallas. She wanted to name her to a high-ranking position within the European Commission and all that. So Ursula's move was to appoint her, but to one of those positions like ambassador to the Vatican or something like that. One of those roles that, well, it's basically the same, right? So anyway, they're at each other's throats, but this lady just can't be... I mean, she doesn't realize that every time she speaks, she's doing the Russians a favor. I mean, She sounds like a Russian propagandist, but she doesn't realize you can't be that foolish, that she's still selling the democracy narrative.
If someone wants democracy the way Kaja Kallas wants it, and doesn't want democracy the way Putin doesn't want it, according to Kaja Kallas, this is the result. Pay attention to democracy in the United States. Hey, this is what Kaja Kallas wants.
Paradise of democracy.
Yes, yes, here this way. Now we're good. Happy Halloween, kids, and remember to say thank you. All right.
Let's see. I thought he was a rock singer or something like that, but...
He kind of reminded me of Ace Frehley, the guitarist from Kiss, with that glam rock vibe, you know?
Yes, but let's see, a little reflection. Can anyone imagine Putin, Lavrov, Xi Jinping, or Wang Yi doing these things? Of course not, right? Can anyone picture that? I honestly can't even imagine it. Putin coming out saying happy, because they also have things like that in Russia. They have some kind of carnivals and so on. But coming out with a wig and everything, saying they're serious people. What kind of image are you giving? I mean, this is the... And then these politicians go around saying, no, it's that Putin. They're populists. No, this isn't populist. I mean, coming out here on Halloween acting silly with that wig isn't populist. I mean, with the wig, please. I mean, well, this is democracy in the West, alive and kicking. Vote for whoever you want. It doesn't matter who wins, because since they're all cut from the same cloth, they keep you entertained with shows like these. Between Trump acting like a fool and saying stupid things every day, and this guy with the wig. By the way, I think they took Trump's too. I think so, huh? Not sure. Because he also put on a circus. Well, aside from wrecking that wing of the White House, I don't know if you've seen the photos, he completely destroyed it. And well, let's see what he does. He told me he's going to make a grand ballroom, but this, anyway, well...
This is like the Titanic's orchestra on its way to the bottom of the sea. Well, that's it. Bread and circuses. No, just circuses. No bread.
No more bread, because I've seen videos, for example, of the subway in the United States. And you think, come on, there are mental hospitals that are in better shape. I mean, people there are more sane. I've even seen videos with rats inside the cars, and people are like, the rat's climbing on me.
That is to say, demolishers, all of you. Everyone please, now head over to our Sister Politics channel, or stay right here for the broadcast of Santiago Martinez's show. Super interesting today about Zionism and Espinosa, more than interesting. So everyone, head over there. And here, Fernando, my dear, 1,000 thanks, as always. We'll be back here on Wednesday, as usual. To those who haven't yet supported us with a like, please remember to give it a like. It helps us fight censorship. To Beatriz Pulido, our dearest Beatriz, greetings and thanks as always. And with that said, everyone, see you soon.
See you later.
Okay.